Where am I? All right. Good. Okay, so we left off talking about suprematism, and the reason it didn't figure too heavily on the midterm was because I didn't feel like I did a good job with it. I was just looking back afterwards, I felt like at the end of class, it's like, what are you talking about? What's the major point? And anyway, I wanted to go back and sort of finish it up. We had a couple artists yet to look at, but it also melds nicely into the next section on the Bauhaus, which we'll be looking at next. So remember, as we looked at suprematism, which is really one of the major feeders for constructivism, right? It's one of the major influences on constructivism. First, obviously, we're talking about Russia now, right? Russia in the early, just prior to the Soviet Union, right? Russia around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? So with suprematism, what we see in the hands of Malevich is that he totally divorces forms from nature. Right? Sometimes they might evoke some sort of natural configuration, but that's not the point, right? So when he does airplane flying, when he mentions that one that he calls airplane flying, it's not that it's supposed to look like an airplane. And it's not supposed to be based on an airplane. It's that the sensation of looking at the picture is similar to the sensation you would have in a flying airplane, right? And for him, it's that supremacy, that's what suprematism means, the supremacy of feeling that the work of art conveys. And in order to make that feeling supreme, what he needs to do is to divorce the painting from the object. Right? So it's a full divorce, utterly intended to be non-representational. Again, he's a theosophist, by the way. Almost everybody that goes over the edge into abstraction has dabbled with theosophical ideas of a peace and harmony that is beyond our everyday experience, right? So divorcing it from nature, forms that are themselves supreme over nature. That's suprematism, right? Constructivism, on the other hand, the forms, while they're also still divorced from nature, the forms aren't based on some idea that they have a link to primal feelings in the same way. But rather, the forms are determined by the materials. The form is not entirely the artist's to choose. But that if you use celluloid on the right, that is going to determine the form. Whereas if you use metal and a block and tackle and some wood, that will determine the form in a different way. That you can't basically, think of a good analogy, right? But not exact. You can't fit a square peg in a round hole. You couldn't make the work on the right, Pevsner's Head of a Woman, from the materials that Tatlin uses on the left. Because the form is determined by the material. And for those of you who have to take this class, the only people who are required to take this class are the studio art majors out there. Right? Allie, you could take a different art history class, right? You don't have to take this one, but Mary's got to take this class, right? Emma's got to take this class. We want you to realize this because you can't paint the same painting with acrylics versus oils versus printmaking versus woodblock. Intaglio versus each one of those materials is going to determine the form. There's only so far you can push it, right? So the constructivists are also interested in a divorce in a way between the form that the artist used and the idea of representation. But there's a connection to the real world that's not necessarily there with Malevich, which is that the reality of the materials you're using dictate what that form is, right? So it connects to the real world, but not in a representational way. Does that make sense? Not in Smile. Then I can fool myself into thinking that I'm doing a good job, right? Sorry? Right. Look at that and remember that is okay. So in other words, that means I'm doing a good job, and not that I should make the exam harder. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, be happy with this, right? Okay. So, right. If the artist is going to make works of art where the materials, where we're supposed to look at the work of art and think about the nature of materials, right? So one of the things I want to get across is, what is the nature of the material I'm using? This is part of the reason that the constructivists, like the suprematists before them, tend to choose simple geometric forms. It's because the simple geometry of the form will allow us then to concentrate on the material. Does that make sense? In other words, the work of art. Okay, this is again. Think about the word transparent, right? It means you can see through it to something else. Okay, but we also use the word transparent for honesty, don't we? Come on, you know, I talk about my supervisors here at Marymount and being very transparent, right? Like I don't have there's no agendas there that people have that I have to try to figure out. In a lot of universities, it's a game and nobody knows how it's played, right? And the rules change. So I have friends who go through tenure and they have no idea what the rules for tenure are. And they don't even know if they're going to make it or not. Marymount is transparent as all heck. They're really great at this way, right? Okay, we use transparent that way. It's honesty, right? What you see is what you get. That's transparency, right? The constructivists want to be transparent. They want you to look at the work of art and know what you're looking at. And in this respect, it's really particularly non-traditional. Because your standard work of art, and this is where the other works like suprematists come into play. Because your standard work of art is you look at the paint and you don't think about paint. You look at the paint and you think about puppy dog, right? You look at the paint, I say puppy dog, sound like dog. You look at the paint and you think about a tree and a forest and two nudes under an umbrella, right? Whatever. And yes, I took umbrella instead of parasol on the exam, right? That was fun, right? You look at the paint, you don't think about paint. Although you're starting to, right? Going back to Manet, you're starting to look at the paint and think about paint rather than a woman sitting by the railway. Okay? This is now taken to the nth degree. You look at it and think plastic, right? Celluloid. You look at it and think rope, metal. Right? It's transparent, it's honest, it's true to its materials. And there's not really a great attempt to hide that. So when we looked at Rodchenko, that painting on board where this machine forms, he allows the board to appear through it still. Because he wants to be true to the material. Right? And when we think about the idea of transparency, one of the things that's interesting about Gabo is the fact that he chooses transparent materials. Right? So that whole metaphor of transparency for him functions on two different levels. One, it is what it is. It is this nylon filament and plastic framing. Right? It is transparent in the term of honesty. But it's also transparent, that you can see right through it. And for him, and really even for Pesner, his brother, and for others, the level of transparency goes to a sort of second level. Not only is it transparent in that it doesn't put any kind of mask or cloud between the work of art and the materials it's made from. Right? There's no barrier there. There's nothing blocking that connection. But there's also, they think, nothing blocking the connection between the work of art and modern experience. These are supposed to connect with modern materials right back to what it means to be alive today. Today being 1943 or 1943. Right? Today being that moment, that these works of art are meant to be expressive of the modern condition. And it's for this reason that they choose ultra-modern materials. They, like us, are products of their day. Right? And the transparency, the idea of seeing through it, is that you should be able to see through it and then think about its connection to your life, today, now. And with these ideas comes this moment, this really fertile moment that this is all happening, which is a moment when society has been turned upside down in Russia. Right? Constructivism starts in 1919. Arguably, the roots are earlier, but the manifesto, written by Tatlin, Vladimir Tatlin, is 1919. Right? That's the official birth of constructivism. That is 2 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. The famous, by the way, 100 years, I just realized it's 100 years ago this month. Right? The October Revolution is October 1917. So the Bolshevik Revolution. And there's a big thing in the Times this weekend, actually. This is what brought it to my mind. There's a huge thing in the New York Times this weekend, the book review, about sort of going back and let's think about the October Revolution. And yes, a lot of things came out of it. Hunter's giving me the stink eye. A lot of things came out of it that ended up not being so great. But at this moment, is that the modern world can change modern experience. There's a hopefulness, and it didn't pan out that way, but there is a hopefulness at least. And let's just look at it on those terms, and we don't have to believe that what they believed was right or anything like that, but we look at what they were thinking, and they were thinking that the industrial world can make the world a better place. And this is especially true in Russia, which was, of all the European countries, more sort of tethered to tradition and to agrarian society, and a lack of industrial progress, right, was hampering Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. And, by the way, speaking of 100 years, I just noticed that Netflix is now streaming Warren Beatty's movie Reds, which is terrific if you haven't seen it. It's a really, really great film. It was up for all sorts of Oscars. He plays John Reed of Reed College, in my hometown. But anyway, all because it's 100 years ago. Where was I? Hope, right? Industry was the hope of the modern world. How could it go wrong? Yeah, we all know now. But I mean, okay, in 1917, the past was bad, the past was mired, the future is industry, and the future is great, right? Modern materials in the hands of the right people were going to make the world a better place. Now, yes, that's not how it worked out. That's not at all how it worked out in history. The ardent socialists out there argued that they never had a chance. It never really was actually put forth in the way it was, but that's regardless. It didn't work out, but still, when we're talking about people like Pevsner, Gabo, etc., working with these ideas, even after Gabo moves to Britain and then America, right, he's still working these ideas through, because there's that idea that you don't have to be a communist to think that industry has the potential to benefit mankind. Right? That's not a communist idea. It's just one that they embraced more strongly than anybody else in the first decades of the 20th century. Right? Lena?
I was going to say that, like you said, like right now, like it's not wrong that they believed that in the hands of the right person, they just didn't have the right person leading them.
Well, arguably the right person doesn't exist because we as humans suck.
That's true.
I mean, that's the bottom line is that we're very self-centered. We're all NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard. We will say things and believe things that are best for us that's our knee-jerk reaction to things. That's sad, but it's true. It takes a lot to be altruistic. It takes a lot to care about someone else's interests above your own. It requires an awful lot of outside of the box thinking, and there are very few people out there that are in that position to do that. There aren't that many people that will give their entire lives to service. There's very few Jimmy Carters out there, right? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, this idea, right, that the work of art is now transparent in a way, right, as a metaphor for this transparency of honesty, but also that the work of art reveals the materials from which it's constructed, right? These ideas underlie, this is the glue that ties these constructivist sculptures to things like Rodchenko's photographs, right? Which are about revealing the nature of materials, right? So the guard at the Shukov Tower is all about revealing the nature of materials, but again, it's about transparency too, isn't it? Right? Because you get this lattice work of the rods of the towers that we see now through. And it makes a nice comparison here with Gabo on the other side, right? About that. This is the same glue that links Rodchenko's his approach to collage, where again, each of the elements of the construction clearly reveal the source of that element. So unlike, for example, a cubist, who give us snippets of words and cut out pieces of paper, right, and a fragment of a cigar or a coffee cup. When we talked about constructivism, we get complete recognizable bits, right? Whether it's a dinosaur, right, a cityscape coming diagonally, a woman leaning on her hand, right? They're not trying to make it all that weird. There's a transparent and honest connection between the element and the work of art, right? So this interest, right, this thing that we were talking about with constructivism is that there's these two elements. One, and they seem contradictory. One, that there is a separation between the different elements that the artist works with and representation. Okay? But on the flip side, there's an honest connection, a transparent connection, between those forms and real elements, real materials, right? You see, don't they seem like I'm speaking on both sides of my mouth, right? No connection to representation, but a direct connection to materials, okay? And these two things come together to make constructivism and their ideas, which is part of the reason why it's a bit confusing sometimes. But it also led in the 1920s to constructivism starting to fragment, right? And there's one group that wants to stick with this idea that abstraction is spirituality, the divorce between the form and representation. That's Malevich, Kandinsky-inspired spiritual science. There's a divorce between them and the Rodchenko side of things that sees a direct and honest connection between the forms and the materials that construct those forms. Right? So there's a spiritual side and a materialist side to constructivism that have, up to the 1920s, sort of intermingled and been sort of making it tough. And by the end of the 20s, they sort of begin to separate the camps. And Rodchenko is going one direction. And we're going to look at another guy who kind of goes in this same direction of the sort of materialist side of things. And it might seem at first like, what are you talking about? This is totally abstract. Right? But Lissitzky, L. Lissitzky, a printmaker, is also in this sort of materialist camp. And this is his single most famous work. Oddly, it's a lithograph, and we do not have an impression anywhere in the DC area. I was really surprised to find out that nobody has an impression of this lithograph. He designed it to go on the side of agitprop trains, agitprop, movement toward propaganda, right? Russian trains that would roll through the countryside and bear the ideas of the new Red Revolution to the people, right? And this is going to go on the side of railroad cars, right? But let me just finish this. I'll get to Kevin. But the thing is that on one hand, it certainly might remind you of Malevich, right? Disembodied, floating, geometric shapes. But within that, there's some differences. One, the most obvious, words, right? And And those words, legible to a Russian audience, basically leave no doubt as to what the narrative is here. It talks about the fact that the whites, represented by the circle, will be defeated by the reds. These are the two opposite sides in the Bolshevik Revolution. Right? The red wedge is piercing the whites. Right? And I looked it up once, but all the words there have to do with exactly that. The reds, the whites, we will defeat, victory. Right? On the other hand, the much more subtle are the three-dimensional bits. Right? Malevich never trafficked in three-dimensional form. Right? At least once he got to suprematism. But you've got these triangles that look like little pyramids on each side. Something down in the lower left corner there that looks like a cubic rod, a rectangular rod. Right? Those are the sorts of things you would never really find in Malevich. And what they end up doing is they bring the construction into things. Right? So the direct relationship of the abstract form to ideas is solidified. That's what puts Rodchenko into this other camp of the sort of literalists, right? The materialists. That and the fact that he's no longer giving us just abstract forms that float in some sort of metaphysical ether, but gives us forms that are, on one hand, directly symbolic of a single idea, one idea. But that idea is also left not to your interpretation, but is literally spelled out for you. Lena, I told you I'd get to you, and there, finally, you had your hand up before.
So you said that it was supposed to be posted on the trains.
Right.
Is there another element of it that when it moves, that it leaves, or is it?
I don't think so. No, I think that the trains. And so I'm no great student of the Russian Revolution, or a great scholar of it. So, but my impression is from movies like Reds, is that they would roll into town and they would be the backdrop for various activities that help spread the word of the new Bolshevik government that is going to be helpful to.
So just propaganda.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not
Propaganda.
supposed to be like another element for when it moves as well as, because you know what I mean, right? Like
Yeah.
as the train is going.
Right. I don't think, no, exactly. I think it's more meant to be seen at the station. Right? So, one of the other things we should talk about with this is the idea of, with both Rodchenko and Lissitzky, is the idea of printmaking as a motif, as opposed to painting or sculpture, right? The constructivists were making works. One of the things that they said was that part of, and this ties into the revolution as well, is that part of making works of art that revealed the nature of materials, right? Where the forms are connected to the physical properties of the materials you're using, was that eventually they could make art in mass production. So that a work of art didn't have to have an exclusive relationship between a wealthy patron like Ali and a poor artist like Mark. Right? That if I make a work of art and I sell one to Ali, I still got 100 more I could sell to everybody else in class. Okay? The democratic about it. Democratic lowercase d. Not democratic as in elected government. Right? Something populist about it. And again, that word's been reinforced too. Okay? Printmaking is, by its very nature, populist. Because when Lissitzky creates the matrix for this print, he can print seemingly endless copies of the same composition. That makes it, lowercase d, democratic. Right? That makes it popular for the populace. Right? Printing, offset printing, right? Photo montage, can do the same thing. If you look back at the full titles of some of the other works we looked at, like Gabo's, they were like spatial construction prototype for something small version, right? And the idea was that it could be reproduced, but what they haven't with a print, there really aren't prototypes. It is, by its very nature, copies. Right? So, if we think about this idea that the whole point of constructivism, one of the major points of constructivism, is that it's trying to make a work of art that can serve society better. Right? How does art serve society better than it already did? Right? Slap it on an agitprop train, wheel it into town. Boom, automatic, right? Social engagement. If you can plaster this thing everywhere, boom, automatic social engagement, right? But a work of art on an easel sold in a gallery by an elite traditional structure only reasserts evil capitalist system, where only the wealthy can buy art. So the whole moment, 1917, 1919, 1920, of the Soviet Revolution, right, the Bolshevik Revolution, is so important to this rethinking about how we make art, what does it mean, and understanding the nature of its relationship to its materials was a hallmark of trying to make art that could extend its reach, right? Could be available to everybody, because art itself should not have something that limits its access to only the chosen few. Say what you will about communism, one of the good things about it is that we're all equal, right? That's one of the central tenets, is that the workers are equal to the owners of the factories. Ditch everything else, take that one home, right? That we are all people, right? And if that's the case, then monetary social stratifications, right, social differences shouldn't dictate who gets to have art. So that's what they're working. Right.
What kind of print is that?
It's a lithograph. So lithographs, it's a good question, Jamie, and you're taking printmaking, so this is why it's pretty good. So the bit that's printed is within the squares, and the bit at the bottom is the signature on top, just like you would do on a. So there are three different ways to make prints. To be basic. Right? One is called relief printing, right? Wood block, linoleum cuts, where you cut away the whites and you roll ink over the top of the bits that are left, and you can just by hand pressure print that onto a piece of paper. Relief printing, right? The second kind is incision-based printing, etchings, engravings, which the printmaking word is intaglio. It's an Italian word, which is where you carve the lines and push the ink down into the line, polish the tops, and pull the ink out of the lines. Okay? So relief intaglio. Litho falls into the third category. I don't have the title off the top of my head for the third category, but you use litho for all sorts of things. Right? Lithography literally means stone print. Right? Litho is stone. Graphy print. And the way lithography was practiced through the 19th century through the 20th was that you took literally a piece of stone. In this case, it would be limestone, which is porous and tends to accept water very well. Right? You get a nice thick piece of limestone, about like yay, sanded perfectly smooth. Got these little filaments, right? And you treat it chemically, so that part of the limestone still receives water, the other part beads it away. Okay? And then what happens is you put a thin layer of water over this treated surface, the water will pull away from the treated areas, stay on the areas where it's untreated. You roll it with an oil-based ink, and since oil and water don't mix, it hits the dry parts of the stone and not the wet parts. Piece of paper goes on it, ink comes off the dry parts of the stone, you do it. Right? So that's another one. Now there's a fourth. I mean, the screen print fits somewhere else as well, right? But under lithography, they've come up with alternative methods because there are only so many limestone blocks in this world that you can get your hands on, and anymore they're almost impossible to find. So if we wanted to do real lithography here, it would be kind of a pinch, right? So they did aluminum plate for a while, but it's incredibly toxic. Incredibly toxic. It uses screen, leave the room when you open up the stuff. Naphtha. You use naphtha, right? right? I'm out there like Vietnam chemical myself, right? Anyway, lithography. So this, right, is two blocks, one for red, one for black, right, on a white sheet of paper that have to be registered together, right, to fit in. And you can imagine there might be one where the red is off, right, throw that one out, right? So it's a multiple tone print, where one is rolled with the red ink, one is rolled with black ink, and registered.
So that kind of reminds me, like, way back when in, like, elementary school, like, we did foam with crayons and watercolors.
Yes, that you would totally could work. I mean, you could do that. You could easily do this with some Crayola.
Yeah.
And or some other kind of wax, hot wax, right? Just or a hot glue. I mean, there's possibilities. You're right. And it's all about the first two are about the physical properties of the top of the plate, right? The third one is about a chemical property, a change to it, and it's about water and oil not mixing together, right? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to look at some Lissitzky lithographs that are very constructivist. These are wonderful, right? In 1920, Lissitzky went to a play, a musical play, in Russia of this musical that had been written in 1913 originally, and was being revived in 1920. Right, so it's just like on Broadway every year, there's a Tony for the best revival production. Right, so imagine West Side Story coming up again or something like that. Right. He goes to see this revival of this play called Victory Over the Sun. And the play was a suprematist play, written by, I don't remember his name. I forget his name. But it was all written in, we had this word that we used, Zaum. Remember this? The suprematists had developed this nonsense language where words were divorced from meaning, called it Zaum. Right? Where words are just used because the sound of the word had connotations, not necessarily any kind of meaning, but just the sound of it expressed something. Right? Remember, it's like Zhang Tutu, right? And there's a huge connection between the futurists and the suprematists. Remember, the suprematists called themselves futurists, right? The last futurist exhibition, right? Malevich organized. So Zaum language was this musical. So the musical is just sang, right? And the libretto, the words to the musical, don't tell any real story, right? And the costumes, I can't imagine, there's no photos. The costumes were designed by Malevich, right? So it's this suprematist drama where people are costumed in things that don't look like standard costumes, and they're speaking this language. And this was revived, and Lissitzky sees it, and he starts to make a series of, I think it's 10 lithographs after characters that appeared in this constructivist drama. And he envisions them as a series of sort of like mechano-men, right? Mechanized men. So you see a head at the top with a sort of cubist face, right? There's a circle with a pipe coming out of it. Within that, in red and black, is the cuboid face, right? The eye, the head, the nose to the side. And then the rest comes down, and the body ends up turning into these mechanical forms that include some sort of strange, well, here I'll highlight the parts I'm talking about, right? Bits that look like construction, like that part, those lines there. Or other bits that, end up looking like a propeller, right? An airplane propeller, right? They're modern industrial machinery that make up this person, some of which are simply rectilinear forms divorced from any direct connection to the world around us, right? So here's that in a nutshell, that constructivist dichotomy, paradox that we were talking about. On the one hand, forms divorced from representation, but on the other hand, forms united with materials, right? And Lissitzky makes these prints showing the various actors in this drama. And there's, like I said, like 10 of them, right? One of them, the very first in the series, showed the mechanical setting for the play. when the play was staged, right, with the idea being suprematist, proto-constructivist drama, was that nothing should get in the way. Think about, okay, what we were just saying about art, right? That there shouldn't be a barrier between the work of art and the materials that it should be honest, it should be transparent, right? That when you look at the work of art, you should be able to understand the materials that were used for that work of art. Right? And you should also be able to understand its relationship to modern experience. Okay? And this is why they choose usually industrial materials. Think about how theater would do that same thing. How could you apply those ideas to theater? Theater relies on disbelief. Theater, remember the famous phrase, I remember this when I was in junior, the willing suspension of disbelief. You look at a theater set, right, a set piece. You look at a backdrop, right? You look at the way lighting is on the stage, and you don't think about the spotlight. You think about the effects of the lighting. You don't think about the backdrop as being just a curtain, but you think about the scene that's illustrated on that backdrop. It is very dishonest in its way. Does that make sense? Right? In other words, when you look at theater, you don't think of a box with people walking around on it. Right? You think of transporting yourself to this artifice that the theater people created. So, in Victory Over the Sun, what they did was to get rid of all of the stagecraft. They might still use lights, but they made a point that you could see where all of the structures were. Don't go on to IMDb, and you just see a movie like, you go on IMDb, read about it, and you say, oh, there's a mistake in this scene because you can see the microphone. You ever do that when you really like the movie? Wife and I watched Baby Driver the other night. Really enjoyed it. So I wanted to go find out more about this movie. It was kind of cool. I love John Hamm. You know, I watch anything with John Hamm for different reasons, right? And he's got this really bad sort of hillbilly haircut in it. And have you seen it yet? It's a great film. It's what's written. Anyway, people will say, but look, there was a discontinuity in this scene, or in that scene you saw the shadow of the technician, or when the car drove by, you saw the camera on the window of the car. Well, this theater piece, in trying to remove the sense of artifice, made sure that you could see the scaffolding that held up the lights, right? That you could see the microphones if they used them at all, right? That there were no backdrops, that you became very aware that you're seeing this in a space that could be manipulated to be something else for a different production. It was honest to its materials. Right? It didn't try to put a barrier between that and make you think that the curtain was anything but a curtain. Right? In fact, it got rid of the curtains altogether. So on the right, what we see are some of the, inspired by the idea that you could see the structure of the stage, the structure and how it's all put together. That's the scene that opens up. This was some of the mechanical setting for Victory Over the Sun. And then we get into this series of figures that appear in the play. Now, I've never read it myself, and I don't know if I could, right? It's in Zound. How are you going to make sense of all of this? But I'd like to find out. The Globetrotters in Time. Doesn't that just make you, that title alone makes me think this got to be really, really cool, right? Globetrotters in Time. So you're not only going around the Earth, right, in space, but you're also moving through time as well, right? The Troublemaker, right? And they're all really very similar to what we saw with Beat the Whites with the Red Square, this sort of combination of abstract, flat, geometrical shapes with three-dimensional bits that suggest construction. The Sentinel, perhaps the most mechanical, three-dimensional of the group, where the head is translated into this half globe with an eyeball that becomes a sort of three-dimensional triangle, right, on the top of it, a foot down there, right? You can almost imagine trying to construct these sorts of things, right? So Lissitzky is certainly on the more material side of things. But again, it's always a bit of a dichotomy because there's always something of the other side as well, right? And these lithos were actually produced when he had gone to Germany. Germany was the hotbed of modern printing processes, and he actually produced these in Germany. Had left Russia specifically for that. He also does a series of paintings. This one is in MoMA up in New York. And his paintings he calls Prouns, P-R-O-U-N. And ideally, I guess I should probably capitalize that all, put it in all caps, because Proun was an acronym in Russian. P-R-O-U-N stood for a project for the affirmation of the new. Projects for affirming something new. Right? Now, what that new is, he doesn't really say, but it's obvious from constructivism what it's all about. It's the modern world. Right? How does he affirm it? Through constructing it. He says that these things are a site for the interchange between painting and architecture. He's constructing, right? And we see him doing that, I think, in The Victory of the Sun Prince as well. He's constructing, right, from these disparate elements, something new. And here's a nice close-up of the center part of Proun 19D, where we can see that there are various elements that are applied to the surface. A wooden board, right, where we can see this part here comes out. This is in 3 dimensions here, right? And that's this bit right here. Here. But he's also then painted around the back to give you that sense of structure. These bits are reflections on the glass, right? You have to ignore that part. Constructions of the new, where he can put together these materials in a way that constructs something for the modern world. Elaine. Proun is, again, projects for affirming the new, right? Or confirming something new. Affirming, yeah. So affirming, confirming, stating, right? All terms. He also took this a step further and constructed a number of Proun rooms, right? Where he took the ideas of constructivism and used them around the walls of the room. And these are, I just still think 100 years on, these are pretty freaking fascinating, right? Now, I got over my youthful zeal and love of socialism a long time ago, back when I got rid of my ponytail and, my attempts to look like Joe Strummer or something. I got rid of all this stuff, but, at the same time, there's the idea that modern construction can lead us to a new utopia. It's something I still think is resonant today. And the way in which they incorporate the energy of futurism into this new abstract language that creates a world that's dynamic and modern and different from anything that ever came before it is something I think that even 100 years later is still pretty avant-garde looking, right? I got 1:45. We still didn't get to Kandinsky. Kandinsky becomes a constructivist. He goes back to Russia, lives in the same building as Lissitzky, becomes a constructivist. And we'll talk about that because that feeds us into the Bauhaus. So that'll be on, what's today? Today's Tuesday, right? It's not Friday yet? Okay. Tuesday. On Friday, we'll talk about the Bauhaus. So on canvas is a couple of shorter RERs. There's just 2 OERs for Bauhaus. You might want to read those over to read about what the Bauhaus was. We'll be talking about that in class on Friday. Okay? And you know what made me rewrite my entire constructivist lecture? Because I read the OER, which I think is fantastic. That art story OER just nails it. It's all, everything I said you can find in the online educational resources. I didn't make anything up there. None of that is original.